All right, we're going to look at exercises 6.2 through 6.4 since they're based off of the same question stem and information. Here we're talking about contribution margin. Remember, contribution margin can be presented in three different ways. It can be presented in a total dollars basis. It can be presented in a per unit basis and presented as a ratio. And just stepping back 1 minute, remember what is contribution margin? Contribution margin is the amount of sales that is left over after all variable costs have been accounted for and taken out. Essentially, that means the amount that's left over to cover all of your fixed costs. If contribution margin is greater than fixed costs, you're going to turn a profit. If it's less than, you're going to operate at a loss. And then obviously if contribution margin is the same as fixed costs, you're going to break even. So looking at these exercises, 6.2 reads, Ruby Corp reports the following information. So we have the sales, we have variable costs. So sales of 540,000, variable costs of 360,000, fixed costs of $150,000, and then we sold 10,000 units. 6.2 wants us to calculate total contribution margin. 6.3 wants us to calculate it on a per unit basis. And then 6.4 wants us to calculate it as the contribution margin ratio. Well, let's take a look at each of the three different scenarios. Looking at 6.2, and we want to calculate a total contribution margin. Remember, the formula for total contribution margin, it's very simple. It's simply sales minus total variable costs. So sales were 540,000. Variable costs were 360,000. So the difference between the two gets us total contribution margin of $180,000. And again, that number is important because if we know what our fixed costs are, if they're less than that, then we know we're going to turn an operating profit. If we know fixed costs are greater than that, then we know we're going to be operating at a loss. So it's, each number, each format of contribution margin gives us a little bit of a different insight, different information there. Looking at 6.3, that wanted us to calculate contribution margin on a per unit basis. How we calculate contribution margin per unit, there's a couple different ways you can do it. Based off of the information that we have right now, we can take our total contribution margin, which we just calculated in 6.2 to be 180,000, and we just divide it by the number of units sold, which was 10,000 units. In this case, we get a contribution margin of $18 per unit. Now, what does that tell us a little bit different than the total contribution margin number that we calculated in 6.2? Well, this $18 per unit, what that tells is that for every unit we sell, we have $18 left over to cover fixed costs and then to contribute to the bottom line once fixed costs are covered. So it's very similar to what we discussed with total contribution margin, but obviously now we know on a per unit basis for every unit that's sold, how much is being contributed to covering fixed costs. And then once fixed costs are covered, to go to the bottom line. So here, obviously, it's just on a per unit basis. And I would say this is much more informative than the total amount. And the reason I say that is, again, a lot of the work that we're doing in this book, it is for internal purposes only. And if I know what my per unit amount is, it's easier for me to compare to years past. So if I was to look at the quarter past, the year past, a couple years past, and compare contribution margin, I get a better sense of that trend analysis if I do it on a per unit basis than if I do it in a total basis. Because the total basis doesn't account for the difference, or when I look at the numbers, it's hard to tell if the difference between, this quarter and last quarter was because we controlled costs, we increased selling price, or if volume was vastly different. Whereas if I break it down to a per unit basis, I eliminate a lot of that noise that could disrupt your analysis of the information that you have here, which is obviously leading to better decisions to be made. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. So I would say if I had to compare the two, I would prefer contribution margin on a per unit basis, but you do get value and insights from both numbers. Finally, exercise 6.4 wanted us to calculate the contribution margin ratio. Essentially what we're doing is converting the per unit amount to a percentage. And I would say that gives us, again, better insight than the total contribution margin number, because it's much easier to compare percentages than it is to compare total dollar amounts, because the total dollar amounts, it's hard to tell if the difference is caused by difference in scale and size and volume, that sort of thing. Whereas all of that is eliminated when I convert to a per unit or to a ratio. So how do I calculate my total contribution margin ratio? Again, there's a couple ways you could do it. You could do contribution margin per unit divided by the selling price per unit, or you could do total contribution margin divided by total sales. I chose to do the latter method. You'll get the same answer. So my total contribution margin we calculated in exercise 6.2 was $180,000. Sales was $540,000. I get a contribution margin ratio by dividing the two. I get 33.33 repeating percent. What does that mean? That means for every unit that's sold of the selling price, a third is left over to contribute to covering fixed costs and to contribute to the bottom line.